Eliza Vaughn was 28 years old when she sat for this photograph in 1867. Within 6 months, 2 men would come looking for her, not to find her, but to destroy what she was hiding. This formal studio portrait, taken in Richmond, Virginia, 2 years after the Civil War ended, passed through 5 generations of the same family. It was tucked inside a leather-bound Bible. No historian ever studied it. No researcher ever requested it. For 152 years, it was classified as just another unidentified portrait from the Reconstruction era, a dignified black mother seated with her 3 children. Beautiful, unremarkable, ordinary. Then, in 2019, a Descendant placed the original print on a flatbed scanner, set the resolution to 1200 dpi, and noticed something no one had ever seen. Something hidden in the folds of a 9-year-old girl's dress collar. Something pressed beneath a mother's palm. By minute 3, you'll see what was hidden inside that collar, and you'll understand why her mother put it there. By minute 10, you'll learn who was hunting this family and exactly what they stood to lose. And by minute 20, you'll hear the words Eliza's great-great-granddaughter spoke when she finally held the proof in her own hands, 152 years later. What you're about to discover is a story about a woman who could not read or write, but who understood with absolute precision the power of a document. A woman who used a photograph not as a memory, but as a vault. A woman who hid her children's freedom inside their clothing, pressed it under her palm, and sat perfectly still while a camera preserved the evidence forever. Let me show you exactly what she did. Let's start with the photograph itself. Here's what you see when you first look at this photograph. A young African-American woman, Eliza, seated in a carved wooden chair with scrolled armrests. She's wearing a high-collared dark cotton dress, buttoned all the way to her throat. The fabric is plain but clean, pressed, deliberate. Her right arm cradles an infant boy, roughly 8 months old, wrapped in a pale cloth that catches the studio light. That's William, her youngest. Standing to her left is her eldest daughter, Clara, age 9. Clara wears a clean white dress with a high folded collar, the kind of collar you'd see on a Sunday best dress, carefully laundered and starched. To Eliza's right stands Josephine, age 6, in a simpler dark dress with small covered buttons. Her hands hang at her sides. Her expression is neutral, watchful. Behind all 4 of them is a painted backdrop, a parlor scene with draped curtains and a classical column, standard for the period. The kind of thing photographers in Richmond used to make a cramped studio look like a fine home. The lighting falls from the left, casting soft shadows across the armrest and along the folds of the children's clothing. Everyone is still. Everyone is composed. Their faces are calm, not smiling, because the long exposure times of the 1860s demanded absolute stillness. A single twitch could blur a face beyond recognition. So they hold, they wait, they endure the seconds. To any historian glancing at this image in a catalog, it would register as unremarkable. A dignified black family, photographed during Reconstruction. One of thousands of similar portraits produced across the South between 1865 and 1870. Beautiful, but ordinary. It is not ordinary. Look at Clara, the eldest daughter. Her white dress has a high collar folded neatly against her neck, but study it closely. The collar is slightly too large for her. It doesn't sit flush the way a properly fitted garment should. It bunches at the neckline. And on the left side there's a visible crease, a ridge running horizontally that doesn't match the fabric's natural drape. It's too rigid, too defined, too straight. At normal resolution it looks like nothing. A wrinkle, a fold, a seam that didn't press flat. Maybe the dress was borrowed from an older girl or hand-sewn without precise measurements. You'd glance at it and move on. Now look at Eliza's left hand. It's resting on the armrest of the chair, palm down, fingers spread wide. It looks like a natural resting position. Comfortable, relaxed. But study the outer edge of her smallest finger. There's a thin line there, a shadow that extends roughly 1 millimeter past the fingertip, running along the grain of the wooden armrest. At first glance, it could be a shadow cast by the angle of her hand against the light. It could be a flaw in the print. A scratch on the glass plate negative. It's not a shadow, and it's not a flaw. When Dr. Lenora Vaughan Harris, Eliza's great-great-granddaughter, scanned this photograph at 1200 dpi in 2019, those two anomalies resolved into something unmistakable. Inside Clara's collar, folded flat against the child's chest and tucked between layers of starched fabric, was a piece of paper. Its edge was visible by approximately 2 millimeters, barely the width of a pencil lead. Under magnification, the texture was clear. Paper fibers, not cotton, not thread, paper, deliberately placed, deliberately hidden. Beneath Eliza's palm, pressed between her hand and the wooden armrest, was a second piece of paper. Its edge extended less than 1 millimeter past her smallest finger. At 1200 dpi, the grain of the paper was distinguishable from the grain of the wood beneath it. Two entirely different textures, layered one over the other, invisible to the naked eye, unmistakable under magnification. Two documents, hidden in plain sight, captured in silver and light, and preserved for 152 years inside a family Bible that 5 generations of women never once disobeyed the instruction to keep closed, safe, and private. The paper in Clara's collar was a manumission document, a legal certificate of freedom dated March 14, 1859. It stated that Thomas Ashford Caldwell of Henrico County, Virginia, did hereby emancipate and set free the woman known as Eliza, and any children born of her body from that day forward and in perpetuity. The paper beneath Eliza's hand was a handwritten birth record on cotton rag paper. It listed 3 children, Clara, Josephine, and William, and named their father, Thomas Ashford Caldwell, master of Briarwood Plantation, Henrico County, Virginia. A freedom paper and a paternity record, hidden in a child's collar and beneath a mother's palm. Photographed together in 1867, 2 years after the war, 2 years into Reconstruction, and 8 years after the documents were first signed. But why? Why would a free woman hide proof of her own freedom? Why would she conceal documents that established her children's legal rights? Why tuck them into clothing and press them beneath her hand instead of carrying them openly, presenting them proudly, filing them with a court? Because someone was trying to destroy them. Dr. Vaughan Harris began where any historian would with the name on the document, Thomas Ashford Caldwell, Henrico County, Virginia. She searched county land records first, then tax rolls, then census data from the 1850s and 1860s. The records were fragmented. Many Virginia courthouses lost files during the war, some to artillery, some to deliberate burning by retreating Confederate forces who preferred destruction to documentation falling into Union hands. Entire decades of property transfers, birth registrations, and legal proceedings vanished in smoke, but enough survived. County tax assessments, federal census enumerations, a handful of estate inventories that had been filed in duplicate with the state capitol before the war began. Enough to build a picture. And the picture was large. Thomas Ashford Caldwell appears in the 1857 Henrico County tax rolls as the owner of Briarwood Plantation, 1,400 acres of tobacco and grain land situated along the bottomlands south of Richmond. The assessed property value was listed at just over $42,000, a figure that placed Caldwell among the wealthiest landowners in the county. The same tax rolls recorded him as holding 31 enslaved persons. 31 human beings listed not by name, but by number, age category, and estimated value. The 1860 federal census provided the rest. Thomas Ashford Caldwell, age 44, born in Virginia, occupation, planter. His wife, Margaret Caldwell, was 39. They had 2 sons, Edward, 18, and James, 15. The household included 3 domestic servants listed by age and sex but not by name, consistent with the census practices of the era, which frequently omitted the names of enslaved individuals living within a slave-holding household. One of those entries reads, "Female, approximately 21 years, mulatto. Eliza." She had no last name in that census, no identity beyond her age, her sex, and the designation of her skin color. She existed in the federal record as a line item in someone else's household, a body counted for tax purposes, a presence acknowledged only to establish the wealth of the man who owned her. But she existed, and she was 21 years old, and she was living in the same house as a man who, 1 year earlier, had signed a paper setting her free. Here's where the document itself becomes suspicious, not because of what it says, but because of when it was written. March 14, 1859. That date matters. Virginia law at the time made private manumission extraordinarily difficult, and deliberately so. An 1806 statute required that any enslaved person freed within the state had to leave Virginia within 12 months or face reenslavement by the county court. By the 1850s, the political climate had hardened further. Courts routinely denied manumission petitions. County judges viewed voluntary emancipation as a threat to the social order, an act that might encourage other enslaved people to expect the same. Freeing an enslaved person in Virginia in 1859 was not a simple signature on a piece of paper. It was a legal act that invited scrutiny, suspicion, community hostility, and in some cases, criminal prosecution. Thomas Ashford Caldwell signed it anyway. And the wording was unusual. Most manumission documents of the period named only the individual being freed, a specific person, identified by name or physical description, released from bondage on a specific date. Caldwell's document went further. It included the phrase, "and any children born of her body." That clause was not standard legal language for a manumission. It was protective. It was forward-looking. It was deliberately written to extend freedom to children who did not yet exist at the time the document was signed. Clara had already been born in 1858, 1 year before the manumission. Josephine would not be born until 1861, William until 1866. Caldwell wasn't just freeing a woman he owned. He was protecting children he hadn't fathered yet. He was protecting a future family. His family. Thomas Ashford Caldwell died in 1864. The precise cause is not recorded with certainty in surviving county histories. Some sources suggest illness. Others reference a wartime incident during the final chaotic year of the Confederacy's collapse. What is recorded, what the documents show clearly, is what happened after he was gone. When Margaret Caldwell and her 2 adult sons began the long, bitter process of sorting the estate, they found more than debt and depleted fields. Among Thomas's personal papers, stored in a writing desk in his study, they found a copy of the manumission document. They found the handwritten birth record. They found proof that their husband and father had freed an enslaved woman, fathered 3 children by her, and documented the entire relationship in writing. In 1866, a complaint was filed with the Freedmen's Bureau office in Richmond. The complainant, a freedwoman whose name was redacted in the surviving file, reported that agents acting on behalf of a former slaveholding family in Henrico County had approached her, demanded the immediate surrender of legal documents in her possession, and threatened her with arrest and imprisonment if she refused to comply. The file does not name Eliza Vaughn, but the details, the county, the timing, the nature of the documents demanded, the description of agents working on behalf of a family rather than an individual match perfectly. Someone had come looking for Eliza, someone with money, legal connections, and a very specific motive. So let's take stock of what we know. A woman named Eliza, freed before the war by the man who fathered her 3 children, is now being hunted by that man's white family. They want to destroy the proof of her freedom and the proof of her children's paternity. Because if those 2 documents survive, the manumission and the birth record, then 3 mixed-race children have a legal claim to a portion of 1,400 acres of Virginia farmland. Eliza has the papers. She knows she's being watched. And in 1867, she walks into a photography studio in Richmond and does something extraordinary. But before we understand why she hid those papers exactly where she did, before we understand the photograph as a weapon, we need to understand what the Caldwell family was willing to do to stop her. Margaret Caldwell was not a passive widow grieving quietly behind drawn curtains. She was a strategist, and she understood exactly what those documents meant, not as family shame, but as financial threat. Within months of her husband's death, Margaret retained an attorney, not a local solicitor, not a courthouse clerk. She retained Henry Poole, a county judge who had served the Confederacy in a civilian capacity during the war, and managed to retain his judicial position afterward through strategic cooperation with Union occupation forces during the early, confused months of Reconstruction. Poole was known in Henrico County legal circles as a man who understood ambiguity. He understood the gaps between federal authority and local practice. He understood that the laws had changed on paper, but the people enforcing them had not. In late 1866, Poole filed a petition in the Henrico County Chancery Court on Margaret Caldwell's behalf. The language was formal. The intent was ruthless. The petition argued that Thomas Caldwell's 1859 manumission of Eliza was legally invalid. The grounds cited were mental incapacity and undue influence. The petition claimed that Eliza, a woman who could not read or write, had somehow manipulated a wealthy, educated, 43-year-old plantation owner into signing a document he did not fully understand. That she had exerted undue influence over a man who owned her body, her labor, and her life. The document was dated 1859. Caldwell was 43 years old at the time of signing. Every other legal and financial document he executed that year, land transfers, tax filings, crop contracts, was accepted by the court without question. Every signature was considered valid. Every transaction was considered the act of a competent, rational man. Only this one, the one that freed a black woman and her children, was challenged as the product of a diseased mind. But the petition went further than challenging the manumission. Buried in the dense legal language, in a subordinate clause on the third page of the filing, was a second demand, one that revealed the true motive behind the entire legal action. Margaret Caldwell's filing asked the court to order the seizure and destruction of, and this is a direct quote from the surviving court record, any and all documents purporting to establish a familial or blood connection between the petitioner's deceased husband and any person of color. That phrase, familial or blood connection, was not about property rights. It was not about the manumission. It was about paternity. Margaret knew about the birth record. She knew it existed. She knew it named Thomas Ashford Caldwell as the father of Clara, Josephine, and William. And she understood with absolute clarity what that document could do in the hands of a sympathetic court. The Freedmen's Bureau tribunals operating across the South during Reconstruction had, in several documented cases, recognized paternity claims brought by formerly enslaved women against the estates of white men who had fathered their children. Federal judges appointed during Reconstruction had, in a handful of precedent-setting cases, upheld inheritance rights for mixed-race children whose parentage could be documented. If Eliza's birth record reached one of those courts, if a federal judge reviewed a document that named a wealthy white Virginia planter as the father of 3 children born to a woman he had personally freed, then 3 mixed-race children could claim a legal share of Briarwood Plantation. 1,400 acres, $42,000, a lifetime of accumulated wealth built on enslaved labor. Margaret Caldwell was not fighting to reclaim a former slave. She was fighting to protect 1,400 acres from 3 children who carried her husband's blood. Stay with me because by minute 14, you'll understand exactly why Eliza chose a photograph as her weapon. Not a letter, not a petition, not an appeal to a court that would never hear her, a photograph. And by minute 20, you'll learn whether she and her children survived what came next. Eliza's situation was not unique. It was not even unusual. Across the post-war South, formerly enslaved people who possessed legal documents, freedom papers, manumission certificates, birth records, property deeds, letters of passage, faced a specific, organized, and systematic threat. White families who stood to lose land, money, or social standing if black paternity claims or inheritance rights were validated launched coordinated campaigns to locate and destroy the paperwork. The method was consistent. Hire agents, find the documents, seize them, or persuade their holders to surrender them, and if persuasion failed, use threats, intimidation, or violence. Once the paper was gone, the claim died with it. A black woman's word against a white family's word in a Southern courtroom in 1866 was no contest at all. In Virginia alone, Freedmen's Bureau records from 1865 to 1868 document over 200 complaints of document theft, forced surrender of freedom papers, and deliberate destruction of birth records, manumission certificates, and property deeds belonging to formerly enslaved people. In at least 14 cases documented in the surviving files, the complainants disappeared entirely after filing. Their cases were marked with a two-word notation that appears over and over in the Bureau's Virginia records: unable to locate. 14 people who came forward to report that someone was trying to destroy their documents. 14 people who were never heard from again. 14 files that were never closed, just abandoned. Eliza knew this. She may not have known the exact numbers. She may not have read the Bureau reports. But she lived in the same city, walked the same streets, attended the same churches, heard the same whispered warnings from the same network of freed people who watched each other's backs because no one else would. She knew that a piece of paper, no matter how legally valid, no matter how clearly signed, could be taken from her hands, torn apart, burned, and then it would be her word against the Caldwell family's word, her voice against Margaret's attorney, her memory against a judge's ruling. She needed a way to make the documents indestructible. She needed a copy that couldn't be burned. She needed evidence that would survive even if the originals were seized from her hands. The Freedmen's Bureau complaint file, the one filed by an unnamed freedwoman matching Eliza's description, contains a follow-up notation. It was handwritten in the margin by a Bureau agent, squeezed into the narrow space between the printed form's border and the edge of the page. The handwriting is hurried, compressed, the pen pressed hard enough to leave an impression on the page behind it. It reads, "Advised complainant to remove herself and children from the county. Agents of the family known to be actively searching." The word actively is underlined twice. Eliza was not imagining the danger. She was not being paranoid. She was not overreacting to rumors. Federal agents, the closest thing to legal protection a black woman had in 1866 Virginia, were telling her, in writing, in an official government file, to run, to take her children and leave, because the people looking for her were not going to stop. Eliza did not appear in the 1867 Richmond City Directory. She was not listed at any address, in any ward, under any variation of any name. She had already begun to disappear from official records, living in the margins of the city, staying with allies in freed people's settlements on the outskirts of Richmond, moving between locations, never staying long enough to be listed, never registering with any authority that might be compelled to share her whereabouts. She was already a ghost in the records, but she had not yet left the city. Because before she left Richmond for good, before she gathered her 3 children and walked away from the only place she had ever known, she did one more thing. One deliberate, calculated, irreversible thing. She walked into a photography studio. She sat down in a carved wooden chair. She placed her eldest daughter to her left, her second daughter to her right. She cradled her infant son in the crook of her arm. She tucked a folded manumission document, the paper that proved her freedom and her children's freedom, into Clara's dress collar. She pressed a handwritten birth record, the paper that named their father and established their claim, beneath her left palm against the armrest. She spread her fingers wide to cover it. She positioned her hand so the edge would be barely visible, enough to prove it was there, not enough to be noticed by anyone who wasn't looking for it. And then she held perfectly still. 15 seconds, maybe 30, not a breath out of place, not a flinch, not a tremor, while the camera's shutter opened and light poured through the lens and silver halide crystals darkened on a glass plate, and everything she needed to protect was captured in an image that could be printed, reproduced, mailed, hidden, and preserved for as long as the paper lasted. She was not posing for a portrait. She was building an archive. She was not remembering her family. She was saving them. After identifying the documents hidden in the photograph, Dr. Vaughn Harris did what she had spent 30 years training her students to do. She followed the paper trail. Not forward, she would search for Eliza's escape route later. First, she went backward, into the Caldwell estate, into Margaret's legal machinery, into the private correspondence of a family that had been prominent enough, wealthy enough, and angry enough to leave behind exactly the kind of evidence they were trying to destroy in someone else's hands. She requested files from the National Archives branch, holding Freedmen's Bureau records for the state of Virginia. She contacted the Henrico County Clerk's office for surviving Chancery court filings. She consulted with 3 legal historians specializing in Reconstruction-era property law and inheritance claims, scholars who had spent decades studying the narrow, contested, and often violent intersection of race, paternity, and land ownership in the post-war South. And she searched for something she suspected might exist, but could not be certain of: personal correspondence, letters, the private words of people who said things in ink that they would never say aloud. The Caldwell family had been prominent enough to leave a paper trail. They had been connected enough to maintain correspondence with relatives across Virginia. And paper trails, as Dr. Vaughn Harris knew better than most, work in both directions. The same instinct that drives a family to document its grievances is the instinct that preserves the evidence of its crimes. She found what she was looking for in an archive, 11 miles from the plantation where Eliza was born. The University of Virginia's Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library holds thousands of letters, diaries, and personal documents from Virginia families of the antebellum and Reconstruction periods. Most are cataloged by family name. Most are accessed by graduate students writing dissertations on agricultural economics or Civil War logistics. Most contain exactly what you would expect: crop reports, weather complaints, requests for money, news of births and deaths, and church socials. The Whitfield family collection, donated to the university in 1930, won by a descendant clearing out an attic, contained 11 boxes of correspondence spanning 1840 to 1890. Mrs. Ann Whitfield was Margaret Caldwell's younger sister. The 2 women wrote to each other regularly. Their letters discussed food prices, servant problems, the health of aging parents, the behavior of children, and the slow, grinding collapse of the world they had known before the war. Dr. Vaughn Harris requested the collection. She sat in a climate-controlled reading room with white cotton gloves and a pencil, no pens allowed near archival materials, and worked through the boxes chronologically. Most letters were exactly what she expected: domestic, practical, mundane. And then she reached Box 7, November 1865, a letter from Margaret Caldwell to her sister Anne. 11 pages. The handwriting tight and slanting, the ink dark, the pen strokes pressed deep into the cotton rag paper as though the writer's hand was clenched around the pen like a fist. Most of the letter dealt with the practical devastations of post-war life: shortages of food, the departure of laborers who had once been enslaved and now, bewilderingly to Margaret, expected wages, the condition of the house, leaking roofs, broken fences, fields going to seed. The tone was bitter, exhausted, and self-pitying, the voice of a woman who understood that she had lost a war but had not yet accepted that she had lost a world. And then, on page 7, Margaret wrote a passage that stopped Dr. Von Harris cold. That made her set down her pencil. That made her read the lines 3 times before she trusted her own eyes. The passage read, "You ask what burden Thomas left me beyond debt. I will tell you plainly, sister, though it shames me to write it. He kept that woman in the East Quarter for years and gave her papers I cannot describe without disgust. She has his face in those children, and she has his name on a document that could ruin us if it reaches the wrong hands. I have engaged Mr. Poole to see it undone. He assures me the law will not permit a Negro woman to claim what belongs to this family by right and by blood." Dr. Von Harris sat in that reading room for a long time after reading those words. Margaret Caldwell knew. She knew about the relationship. She knew about the years it had lasted. She knew about the manumission, the papers she could not describe without disgust. She knew about the birth record, the document with Thomas's name. She knew about the children, and she acknowledged in a moment of involuntary honesty that she probably never expected anyone outside her family to read, that those children carried her husband's face, his features, his blood, his resemblance. She has his face in those children. Margaret saw it. Every time she looked at Clara, at Josephine, at the infant William, she saw her dead husband looking back at her through the eyes of children she wanted to erase from existence. And she described the threat with a precision that any lawyer would admire. A document that could ruin us if it reaches the wrong hands. Eliza had the document, and Margaret could not find her. We need to pause here. We need to address something directly, without flinching, without softening, and without romanticizing. The manumission document and the birth record tell a specific legal story. A man freed a woman. A man acknowledged his children. A man signed papers that protected a family he could never publicly claim. Read one way, it could sound almost noble, almost loving, almost like a story of devotion expressed through the only language available, the language of law. But the story beneath the legal story is darker and more complicated, and it must be told honestly. Eliza was enslaved when this relationship began. She was approximately 19 years old in 1858 when Clara was born. Thomas Ashford Caldwell was 42. He owned her, completely, absolutely, without exception or appeal. He controlled her housing, he controlled her labor, he controlled her movement, he controlled her body. Under the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Eliza was not a person. She was property. She could be sold. She could be punished. She could be separated from any child she bore at the owner's discretion. She could not leave. She could not refuse. She could not appeal to any authority because no authority recognized her right to appeal. Whatever the private dimensions of this relationship, and we cannot know them with certainty across a distance of more than 160 years, it began within a system of absolute coercion. The manumission of 1859 may reflect genuine feeling on Caldwell's part. It may reflect guilt. It may reflect a complicated, contradictory mixture of both. We cannot know. What we can know, what the historical record makes inescapable, is this. The relationship began without the possibility of free consent, and no document signed afterward can retroactively create the consent that the system made impossible. Eliza's brilliance, her strategic intelligence, her breathtaking courage, her fierce and methodical protection of her children exists alongside this origin, not despite it, alongside it. She did not choose her circumstances. No one asked her. No one consulted her. No one gave her a voice in the matter of her own body. What she chose, the only thing she could choose, was what to do within those circumstances. And what she chose to do was fight. Not with words she couldn't write, not with a legal system that categorized her as furniture, not with a political process that did not acknowledge her existence. She fought with the only tools available to her: paper, cloth, and light. There's one more detail about the birth record that matters, a detail that points to the existence of an ally whose name we may never know. The handwriting on the birth record does not match Thomas Caldwell's signature on the manumission document. A forensic document examiner, retained by Dr. Vaughn Harris in 2020 and working from high-resolution scans of both documents, confirmed that the birth record was written by a different person entirely. The hand was practiced, educated, consistent with either a literate domestic worker within the Caldwell household or a sympathetic white clerk with access to the family's private records. Someone inside or close to the Caldwell household knew the truth about those children, knew who their father was, knew what the manumission meant, and that person chose, deliberately, knowing the risk, to write it down, to create the one document that linked Thomas Caldwell's name to Eliza's children by blood, to put pen to paper and record the thing that everyone in the household knew and no one was supposed to say. Without that birth record, the manumission alone would have freed Eliza. It would have guaranteed her children's liberty, but it would not have established paternity. It would not have created an inheritance claim. It would not have given 3 mixed-race children a legal foothold on 1,400 acres of Virginia land. Whoever wrote that birth record understood exactly what they were creating. They understood the power of it. They understood the danger of it, and they did it anyway. We don't know their name. We may never know. The handwriting has been analyzed, compared to other documents from the period, cross-referenced against known samples from Henrico County clerks and literate enslaved persons. No match has been found. But they gave Eliza the most dangerous piece of paper in Henrico County, and she kept it for the rest of her life. In early 1867, the case appeared on the Henrico County Chancery Court docket. It was listed under a name that tells you everything you need to know about how the legal system of the period regarded Eliza Vaughn. Caldwell versus freedwoman Eliza. No surname. The court did not recognize her right to one. She was identified by her first name and her status, freedwoman, as though freedom itself were an occupation, a temporary condition, a label that could be applied or removed at the court's discretion. Judge Poole had scheduled a hearing for March 1867. If Margaret Caldwell prevailed, and in a Henrico County courtroom before a judge with Confederate sympathies and financial ties to the planter class, the odds were overwhelmingly in her favor. The consequences would be immediate and irreversible. The manumission would be declared void, not unenforceable, void, as though it had never been signed. The birth record would be ordered surrendered to the court and destroyed. Eliza's children would retain their physical freedom. The 13th Amendment guaranteed that much, and even Poole could not overrule the Constitution, but they would lose every other legal connection to their father. Any claim to the estate, any documented proof of who they were, any evidence that Thomas Ashford Caldwell had ever acknowledged their existence. They would be free, but they would be no one's children. Eliza had weeks. She had 2 pieces of paper. She had 3 children under the age of 10. She had no lawyer, no money, no allies with legal standing, and no ability to read the documents she was fighting to protect. And she had one idea. She would make a photograph. So here is where Eliza Vaughn stood in the winter of 1867. A court date was approaching that could erase her children's legal identity, strip them of their father's name, their inheritance claim, and the documented proof of their freedom. Hired men were searching for her across Richmond. The only evidence of her family's rights existed on 2 pieces of paper that could be seized, burned, confiscated, or lost. She couldn't read those papers. She couldn't copy them by hand. She couldn't mail them to a lawyer because no lawyer in Virginia would take her case. So she walked into a photography studio, hid the papers on her body and her daughter's body, and asked a photographer to do the one thing she couldn't do herself, make a permanent, portable, reproducible image of the evidence. A copy that could survive even if the originals were destroyed. A record written in light instead of ink. The question now is simple. Did it work? Did she get out of Virginia before the court date? Did the children survive? And what became of the family that tried to erase them? sometime in the autumn of 1867. The exact date is not recorded in any surviving document. Eliza made the decision to leave Virginia. We don't know the precise trigger. We don't know if a specific warning reached her through the informal network of freedpeople and bureau agents who watched each other's movements and shared intelligence about threats the way soldiers share intelligence about enemy positions. We don't know if she saw one of Margaret Caldwell's hired men on a street corner. We don't know if a friend told her that someone had been asking questions at a church she attended, or a market where she bought food, or a settlement where she sometimes slept. What we know is what she chose to leave behind. She had been living in Richmond for at least 2 years after the war's end. She had built connections, fragile ones, temporary ones, but connections nonetheless. She had allies, other freed people, bureau agents who had taken note of her case. Possibly the photographer who had helped her create the portrait. A collaborator whose identity has never been established, but whose technical choices suggest someone who understood exactly what Eliza was doing and deliberately calibrated the lighting and angle to minimize the visibility of the hidden documents while still capturing them on the glass plate. She had a life, small, precarious, threatened, but a life. She left all of it. She took her 3 children, Clara, 9 years old, Josephine, 6, William, not yet 2, still small enough to be carried on a hip, still young enough that the journey would mean nothing to his conscious memory but everything to his future. She took the leather-bound Bible. She took the manumission document and the birth record, the originals, not copies, because no copies existed except the ones embedded in the photograph. And she took the photograph itself. Everything she needed to prove her children's identity, their freedom, their paternity, and their legal claim to an inheritance that a wealthy white family was spending a fortune to deny. All of it fit inside a Bible and a single photographic print small enough to hold in one hand. To understand why Eliza chose a photograph, why she didn't simply hide the documents in the Bible and run, you have to understand the technology of the moment and the specific problem she was trying to solve. The problem was fragility. Paper burns, paper tears. Paper can be seized from your hands by a man with a badge or a man with a gun, and once it's gone, it's gone. Your word that it once existed means nothing in a courtroom. Your memory of what it said carries no legal weight. The document is the proof. Without the document, there is no proof. And without proof, there is no claim, no freedom, no identity, no name. But a photograph taken from a glass plate negative could be printed multiple times. Copies could be sent to different locations, to allies, to churches, to meeting houses in other states. If one print was destroyed, another could be made from the same negative, assuming the negative survived in the photographer's studio. The technology was, in 1867, one of the few systems available to an ordinary person that allowed for the creation of permanent, portable, reproducible documentation. Richmond in the late 1860s had several photography studios that actively served the freed people community. Advertisements in the Richmond Whig newspaper from 1866 show studios offering portrait cards, small photographic prints sized to fit in a pocket or an envelope, and duplicate prints at reduced rates. The cost of a sitting and a single print was roughly equivalent to a day's wages for a skilled laborer. It was not trivial, but it was not impossible. Eliza may not have understood the chemistry of silver halide crystals reacting to light. She may not have known that the image on the glass plate was formed by the differential darkening of photosensitive compounds fixed in a collodion emulsion. She did not need to understand the science. She understood the principle. If I place these documents in this picture, if I hide them on my body and my daughter's body and the photographer captures them, then even if someone takes the papers from my hands, even if the originals are burned, even if a judge orders their destruction, the photograph will show they existed. The image becomes the proof. The portrait becomes the vault. That is what she built, not a memory, not a keepsake, not a sentimental record of a family posing in their Sunday best. A legal instrument, disguised as a family portrait. The Freedmen's Bureau maintained transportation assistance logs for freed people who needed to relocate due to documented threats. The logs were not comprehensive. The Bureau was chronically underfunded, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of displaced people moving across the South, and staffed by agents who often handled hundreds of cases simultaneously. But they existed, and some of them survived. In the January 1868 transportation log for the Richmond Field Office, now held in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., there is an entry, number 214 on the page, written in a clerk's careful hand. It reads, "Eliza and 3 children, passage authorized to Washington, category, persons facing documented threat, accompanied by letters of introduction to friends meeting Georgetown." The entry does not list a surname. It does not describe the nature of the threat. It does not identify the family pursuing her. But the category designation, persons facing documented threat, was not a label applied casually. Bureau procedures required a field agent to personally review the case and verify that the individual faced a specific, credible, documented danger before authorizing assisted relocation under that category. Someone in the Richmond office had reviewed Eliza's situation, had read the complaint file, had noted the follow-up annotation with its twice underlined actively, had weighed the evidence, and determined that she and her children were in sufficient danger to warrant government-assisted passage out of the state. The reference to friends meeting Georgetown tells us exactly where she was headed first. The Society of Friends, the Quakers, operated one of the most effective and best documented support networks for freed people in the post-war period. Their meeting houses functioned simultaneously as houses of worship, safe houses, employment placement agencies, and informal legal aid centers. The Georgetown Monthly Meeting, situated in the federal capital, had a specific and well-documented history of receiving and sheltering black families fleeing threatening conditions in Virginia. Eliza was not wandering. She was not stumbling northward in the dark, hopping to find safety through luck or providence. She was being guided, handed from one station to the next, passed through a network that had been operating in various forms since before the war, and that now, in the uncertain years of Reconstruction, continued its work with quiet, methodical persistence. If you're still watching, you already understand what Eliza was running from: a wealthy white family with lawyers, hired agents, and a cooperative judge, spending money they couldn't afford to destroy the proof that 3 children were free and fathered by the man who had owned their mother. What you don't know yet is whether she made it, whether her children grew up, whether Clara ever wore that white dress again, whether William ever learned the name of the man whose blood he carried, whether anyone alive today knows Eliza's name. Stay with me, because the next 4 minutes change everything. The Georgetown Monthly Meeting Logbook, preserved in the Quaker archives at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, contains an entry dated February 1868. The handwriting is plain, unadorned. The Quakers did not embellish their records. They documented, they noted, they moved to the next entry. It reads, "A woman called Eliza with 3 small children arrived from Virginia under care of Richmond friends, sheltered and provided for, to be forwarded to Philadelphia meeting when passage is arranged." 29 words. That is all the logbook gives us. 29 words covering what must have been one of the most terrifying and exhausting journeys of Eliza's life. A journey from Richmond to Washington, D.C., in the middle of winter, with a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a toddler, carrying a Bible that contained the entirety of her family's legal existence. 3 months. That's how long Eliza stayed in Washington. 3 months in a Quaker meeting house in Georgetown, sleeping on narrow cots in a room shared with other families, eating communal meals prepared in a kitchen that served dozens of displaced people at a time, watching her children play in a walled courtyard while she waited for word that passage to Philadelphia had been arranged and that it was safe to move again. 3 months of uncertainty. 3 months of listening for footsteps that didn't belong. 3 months of wondering whether Margaret Caldwell's agents had followed her across the state line. 3 months of holding the Bible close. But she was alive. Her children were alive. And the documents, the manumission, the birth record, the photograph, were still in her possession, still pressed between the pages of the Book of Psalms, still safe. Washington was safer than Richmond, but it was not safe enough. And Eliza, whether through her own instinct or through the counsel of the Quakers who sheltered her, understood why. The District of Columbia in 1868 was a city in violent transition. Freed people poured in from Virginia, Maryland, and points south. Tens of thousands of displaced men, women, and children seeking work, shelter, and distance from the places where they had been enslaved. Federal officials administered a patchwork of new laws and old customs. Former Confederates walked the same streets as Union veterans, bureau agents, and black families building new lives in the shadow of a Capitol dome that had been completed, with exquisite irony, partly by enslaved labor. Legal jurisdiction was tangled beyond comprehension. A court order issued in Virginia could, under certain circumstances, be recognized and enforced in Washington, particularly if a sympathetic local judge agreed to cooperate. Margaret Caldwell's attorney, Judge Poole, had connections that extended well beyond Henrico County. The informal networks of former Confederate officials and sympathizers operated across state lines with an efficiency that the federal government could not match. Eliza needed a city where she could truly vanish, a city with a black population large enough to absorb a woman and 3 children without attracting notice, a city with its own established network of churches, mutual aid societies, schools, and employment networks, institutions that operated independently of Southern legal systems and Southern sympathies. She needed Philadelphia. In the spring of 1868, with passage arranged and paid for by the Georgetown meeting, Eliza Vaughn and her 3 children boarded a northbound train. She carried a Bible, a photograph, and 2 pieces of paper that a wealthy white family in Virginia would have paid any price to destroy. She was 30 years old. She could not read the documents she was protecting. She could not write a letter to announce her arrival. She could not sign her own name on the travel authorization that the Quakers had prepared on her behalf. But she had outmaneuvered a county judge. She had evaded 2 hired agents. She had turned a photography studio into an evidence locker. She had hidden freedom in a collar and paternity under her palm. And she had done all of it, every strategic calculation, every deliberate choice, every act of resistance disguised as stillness, without the ability to read or write a single word. She did not need literacy. She needed intelligence, and she had more of it than everyone who was chasing her combined. And then the trail went cold. Dr. Vaughn Harris turned her research northward, away from Virginia courthouses and Freedmen's Bureau files, and into the vast, fragmented, imperfectly indexed archives of mid-19th century Philadelphia. She searched city directories from 1868 and 1869, the thick, alphabetically organized volumes that listed residents by name, address, and occupation. No Eliza Vaughn. She searched the 1870 federal census for Philadelphia County, every ward, every enumeration district, every page of every volume. No match by name, no match by age and description. She searched church admission records from the African Methodist Episcopal congregations that served the 7th Ward, school enrollment lists from the few institutions that accepted black children, mutual aid society membership rolls, charity organization intake logs. Nothing. For 5 months, Dr. Vaughn Harris could not find Eliza Vaughn in Philadelphia. She knew her ancestor had arrived, family oral history, passed down through 5 generations, consistently placed Eliza in Philadelphia by the late 1860s. The Georgetown meeting logbook explicitly referenced forwarding her to the Philadelphia meeting. Every piece of indirect evidence pointed to the same city. But the official records were silent. Eliza had vanished into Philadelphia as completely and thoroughly as she had vanished from Richmond, as though she had stepped off the train and dissolved into the crowds of the 7th Ward like a drop of water into a river. 5 months of searching, 5 months of cross-referencing databases, scrolling through digitized census microfilm, requesting boxes of records from the Philadelphia City Archives, and finding nothing. 5 months of the specific, grinding frustration that every genealogist knows, the knowledge that the person you're looking for was there, was real, was alive, and yet left no trace that your methods can detect. And then Dr. Vaughn Harris realized why. The name was wrong. Eliza had not registered under the surname Vaughn. In fact, the name Vaughn does not appear in any official record connected to Eliza until the 1880 federal census, 12 full years after her arrival in Philadelphia. In the early years, the dangerous years, the years when Margaret Caldwell's agents might still be searching, the years when a court order from Virginia might still be enforceable, Eliza used a different name entirely. Dr. Vaughn Harris believes this was deliberate, not accidental, not a clerical error, not the result of a census enumerator's sloppy handwriting. Deliberate, a protective measure possibly suggested by the Quaker network, which had extensive experience helping people disappear. If Margaret Caldwell's agents came to Philadelphia looking for a black woman named Eliza, they would search for that name. They would canvass churches and markets and boarding houses asking for Eliza. They would check city directories and tax rolls and census lists for the name they knew. They would not find it because it wasn't there. Dr. Vaughn Harris changed her search strategy entirely. She stopped looking for a name. She started looking for a pattern, a household composition, a specific demographic fingerprint. She searched for a single black woman, age approximately 30, with 3 children, a girl aged approximately 10, a girl aged approximately 7, and a boy aged approximately 2 living in Philadelphia, having arrived between March and June of 1868. She ran the search against every available dataset, city directories, census records, church rolls, tax assessments. She found one match. One household in all of Philadelphia that matched every parameter. One family with exactly the right composition, the right ages, the right arrival window, living in exactly the neighborhood that family oral history had always identified. One match. The 1870 federal census for Philadelphia's 7th Ward, enumerated on June 14, 1870, by a census taker walking door to door through the narrow streets south of Spruce, contains the following entry. Eliza Brown, age 31, black, female, occupation seamstress, household includes 3 children, Clara, age 11, Josephine, age 8, William, age 3. The ages match, the sexes match, the number of children matches. The occupation, seamstress, matches the family oral history that had been passed down through 5 generations, consistently describing Eliza as a woman who sewed for a living. Eliza Brown, not Eliza Vaughn. Brown, a common surname, unremarkable, untraceable, shared by thousands of black families across the Northeast. The perfect name for a woman who needed to be invisible. But 10 years later, in the same ward, at the same address on Lombard Street, the same household reappears in the 1880 census under a different name. The name Eliza had chosen for herself. The name she had carried privately for years and now, finally, felt safe enough to use publicly. Eliza Vaughn, age 41, black, female, occupation dressmaker. Clara Vaughn, age 21, occupation teacher. Josephine Vaughn, age 18, occupation church musician. William Vaughn, age 13, occupation printer's apprentice. The same family, the same address. The same woman 12 years older, her occupation upgraded from seamstress to dressmaker, her children grown, educated, and employed. She made it. They all made it. Eliza Vaughn operated a tailoring shop on Lombard Street in Philadelphia's 7th Ward for over 20 years. She specialized in dressmaking and alterations, serving the neighborhood's growing black middle class, the families of ministers and teachers and shopkeepers who needed Sunday clothes and wedding dresses and mourning garments made with care and precision by hands that understood fabric the way a musician understands sound. Philadelphia city business directories list her shop continuously from 1875 through 1898. 23 years of unbroken operation. 23 years of a woman who couldn't sign her own name running a business that required her to take measurements, negotiate prices, manage materials, and satisfy customers. Clara Vaughn attended the Institute for Colored Youth, the institution now known as Cheney University of Pennsylvania, the oldest historically black university in America. She graduated in 1879. By 1882, she had begun teaching in Philadelphia's public school system, one of the first black women to hold a permanent teaching position in the city. She taught for over 30 years. Generations of children in the 7th Ward learned to read and write from the daughter of a woman who could do neither. Josephine Vaughn became a church organist and choir director at Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the oldest and most important black congregations in the nation. Founded in 1794 by Richard Allen, Mother Bethel had been a center of black spiritual, political, and intellectual life for decades before Eliza arrived in Philadelphia. Josephine served there for more than 30 years, filling the sanctuary with music every Sunday morning. William Vaughn apprenticed as a printer at the age of 13, setting type by hand, letter by letter, in a trade that demanded the same precision and patience that his mother brought to a needle and thread. By his late 20s, he had moved to Baltimore and established a small black-owned newspaper, one of dozens that emerged during the great expansion of the black press in the 1890s, when African-American publishers across the country built platforms for voices that no white-owned paper would carry. A seamstress, a teacher, a musician, a publisher. 4 lives built on 2 pieces of paper and 1 photograph. Eliza Vaughn never wrote a single word in her entire life. She never learned to read. She never learned to write her own name. She signed every document, every lease, every business license, every tax receipt with an XA mark, a placeholder where a signature should be. The X of a woman who built an archive, outmaneuvered a judge, and protected 3 children's futures through strategic brilliance, but who could not form the letters of her own name. She left no diary, no memoir, no letter to a friend, no written record of her own thoughts, her own feelings, her own memory of the photograph that saved her family. But Clara could write. And Clara did write. And in 1911, 44 years after the photograph was taken, Clara sat down and wrote a letter to a friend named Henrietta Collins. The letter discussed many things: church matters, a recipe for sweet potato bread, concerns about changes in the neighborhood, the health of a mutual acquaintance. The kind of letter that women wrote to each other in 1911, domestic, personal, newsy, warm. But near the end, in the final paragraph, almost as an afterthought, almost as though the thought arrived unbidden, and Clara felt compelled to set it down before it faded, she wrote a passage about her mother that has never been published, that has never been read by anyone outside the family, until now. Clara wrote, "Mother kept the photograph in the Bible always. She would not allow it to be framed or hung on any wall. She said it was not for decoration. She said it was for proof. When I was small, I did not understand what she meant. When I was grown, I asked her what proof she needed when we were already free and already safe. She looked at me and said, 'You are never so safe that you do not need proof.'" Clara continued, "She held my face in her hands when she said it. I have never forgotten her hands. I have never forgotten her hands. The same hands that pressed a birth record against a wooden armrest in a Richmond photography studio in 1867. Fingers spread wide, palm flat, holding the paper steady while light entered the lens and preserved the evidence. The same hands that tucked a manumission document into a 9-year-old girl's collar and smoothed the fabric down to hide the edges. The same hands that carried a Bible and 3 children from Richmond to Washington to Philadelphia. The same hands that cut fabric and stitched seams and built a tailoring business on Lombard Street that lasted 23 years. The same hands that held her grown daughter's face in a Philadelphia kitchen 40 years later and spoke the only truth she had ever needed to know. You are never so safe that you do not need proof. The same hands that never once held a pen. Eliza Vaughn survived. Her children survived. They built lives, careers, families, legacies in a city 600 miles from the plantation where Eliza was born into bondage. Clara taught children to read. Josephine filled a church with music. William printed words on paper, the son of an illiterate mother, making his living with language. But the story doesn't end with survival. Because while Eliza was building a life in Philadelphia, while her children were growing, learning, becoming, the family that tried to erase them was destroying itself. And what happened to the Caldwell estate, to Margaret, to Judge Henry Poole, to the 1,400 acres of Briarwood Plantation, is a story of justice that no court ever had to deliver. Margaret Caldwell did not give up. That is the single most important thing to understand about the years between 1867 and 1870. Eliza vanished from Richmond in the autumn of 1867. She was sheltered in Washington by the winter of 1868. She arrived in Philadelphia by the spring. She changed her name. She disappeared into the 7th Ward. She became invisible. And Margaret kept looking. Court records from the Henrico County Chancery Court show that the petition, Caldwell versus Freedwoman Eliza, was continued 3 times between 1867 and 1869. Continued, not dismissed, not withdrawn, continued, postponed, pushed forward on the docket, and then delayed again when the respondent could not be produced. Each time the notation entered into the record was identical. 3 words repeated across 3 years of legal filings. Respondent cannot be located. 3 words that represented, for Margaret Caldwell, an ongoing hemorrhage of money, time, and hope. Fragments of the Caldwell estate's financial records, surviving in the Henrico County Clerk's office among papers that were never formally cataloged, never digitized, and never examined by any researcher until Dr. Vaughn Harris requested them in 2020, show a pattern of payments that tells its own story. Quarterly disbursements to 2 individuals identified only by initials, RH and JS. The payments began in late 1867 and continued through 1870. They totaled just over $600, a sum that, adjusted for the period, represented a significant expenditure for a family whose primary asset was a plantation that could no longer produce. Margaret Caldwell was paying 2 men, agents, investigators, hired searchers, to find a woman who had vanished. She was spending money she did not have, drawn from an estate that was already failing, to pursue a legal case that could not proceed without a respondent who could not be found. She was bleeding the plantation dry, not to save it, to satisfy a grudge. And the money was running out. Briarwood Plantation did not survive the decade. The forces arrayed against it were not dramatic. There was no fire, no raid, no act of God or violence of nature that destroyed the estate in a single catastrophic event. What destroyed Briarwood was something slower, quieter, and far more thorough: mathematics. The post-war agricultural depression hit Virginia tobacco plantations with particular severity. The crop that had sustained the Caldwell family for 3 generations required labor, enormous quantities of coordinated, skilled, physically demanding labor, and that labor had, until 1865, been provided by enslaved human beings who received no wages. After emancipation, the same work required hired hands. Hired hands required wages. Wages required cash. Cash required crop sales. and crop sales, in a depressed market flooded by competing producers and disrupted by the destruction of rail and river infrastructure during the war, generated a fraction of their pre-war value. Margaret Caldwell's ongoing legal and investigative expenses, the quarterly payments to RH&JS, the attorney fees for Judge Poole, the court filing costs, the incidental expenses of a legal campaign that produced no results, accelerated the decline. Money that might have been spent on seed, equipment, or wages flowed instead into the pockets of two men who searched and found nothing. In 1873, the first parcel of Briarwood Plantation was sold. 300 acres of bottomland, the most fertile portion of the estate, the land that had produced the richest tobacco harvests for decades, was purchased by a Northern Investment Consortium for 11 cents on the dollar of its assessed value. The buyers were businessmen from New York and Connecticut. They had no interest in tobacco. They intended to subdivide and resell. By 1876, a second parcel was gone. 400 acres, including the main tobacco fields, sold at public auction to satisfy debts that could no longer be deferred. The auctioneer's notice, published in the Richmond Dispatch, described the property in language designed to attract buyers. It did not mention the Caldwell name. It did not need to. Everyone in Henrico County already knew. By 1879, the remaining 700 acres, including the main house, the outbuildings, the east quarter where Eliza had once lived, and the study where Thomas Caldwell had signed the manumission document 20 years earlier, were purchased by a Baltimore land speculator who converted the entire property into tenant farms. The main house was subdivided into apartments. The study became a storage room. Margaret Caldwell, who had gone to court to protect 1,400 acres from the inheritance claim of 3 mixed-race children, lost all 1,400 acres. Not to Eliza, not to a federal judge, not to a Freedmen's Bureau ruling, but to the slow, grinding, indifferent arithmetic of a world that had moved past her and did not care enough to notice her fall. And Judge Henry Poole, the attorney who had filed the petition, who had argued that a 43-year-old plantation owner was mentally incapacitated because he freed a black woman, who had used his judicial position to protect the interests of families like the Caldwells in exchange for fees and favors, did not escape either. In 1871, a federal investigation into corruption among former Confederate officeholders who had retained positions of power during Reconstruction uncovered evidence that Poole had used his bench to protect pre-war property interests in exchange for direct payment. The investigation documented a pattern of rulings that consistently favored white landowners in disputes with formerly enslaved people, rulings that were not merely biased but purchased. Poole was removed from the bench. He was disbarred. His name was struck from the rolls of the Henrico County Bar. He died in 1883. The same year, the very same year that Clara Vaughn, the girl who had carried a manumission document in her dress collar at the age of 9, received a formal commendation from the Philadelphia Board of Education for excellence in teaching. Margaret Caldwell's 2 sons left Virginia. They did not stay to fight for what remained of the estate. There was nothing left to fight for. Edward, the elder son, moved to Tennessee. He found work as a clerk, a desk job unremarkable, anonymous. A man whose father had owned 1,400 acres and 31 human beings spent his remaining years copying figures into ledgers for someone else's business. James, the younger son, vanished from the documentary record entirely after 1877. His fate is unknown. No census entry, no death certificate, no marriage record, no obituary. He simply disappears, a gap in the archive, an unanswered question, a life that left no trace. 1880, the name Caldwell appeared nowhere in Henrico County, not in the tax records, not in the voter rolls, not in the property registries, not on any deed, any lease, any business license, any church membership roll. The family that had owned 1,400 acres, held 31 human beings in bondage, employed a corrupt judge to weaponize the legal system, and hired 2 agents to hunt a black mother across the state of Virginia, had itself been erased. Completely. Thoroughly. As though they had never existed. Margaret died in 1884. She was living in a boarding house in Lynchburg, Virginia, a city 60 miles from the plantation she had once presided over. No obituary has been found in any surviving newspaper. No gravestone has been located in any Lynchburg cemetery. The woman who wrote to her sister that Eliza's children could ruin us. The woman who spent a fortune trying to destroy 2 pieces of paper died without enough money to mark her own grave. 600 miles north, on Lombard Street in Philadelphia's 7th Ward, the sun came through the front window of a tailoring shop. Eliza Vaughn was fitting a dress for a customer. The pins were held between her lips. Her hands moved with the precision of 30 years of practice, measuring, cutting, shaping fabric into something that would make another woman feel beautiful. Down the street, Clara was teaching children to read. In the sanctuary of Mother Bethel AME, Josephine was rehearsing hymns for Sunday. In a print shop in Baltimore, William was setting type, letter by letter, word by word, building sentences that other people would read. No commentary is necessary. The facts are sufficient. The contrast is complete. No court ever ruled on the case of Caldwell versus freedwoman Eliza. The petition was never formally dismissed. It was never withdrawn by Margaret's attorneys. It was never adjudicated by a judge. It simply lapsed, buried in a county clerk's filing cabinet under decades of accumulating dust and newer, more urgent cases. A legal ghost, technically active, practically dead, forgotten by everyone except the family it was designed to destroy and the family it failed to protect. No judge ever declared the manumission valid. No ruling ever formally established Thomas Caldwell's paternity. No inheritance was ever claimed. No portion of Briarwood Plantation ever passed to Eliza's children through legal channels. The system that Margaret Caldwell had tried to weaponize against Eliza never delivered the justice Eliza deserved, but it also never delivered the destruction Margaret intended. It simply ground to a halt, overwhelmed by its own contradictions, and fell silent. Eliza never got legal justice. She never stood before a judge who recognized her claim. She never heard a ruling in her favor. She never received a deed, a settlement, a formal acknowledgement of what was taken from her and what was owed. She got something rarer. She got a life. Her children got lives. Clara got a classroom. Josephine got a choir. William got a printing press. And Margaret Caldwell got a boarding house in Lynchburg and an unmarked grave. The family that tried to erase Eliza's children got exactly what they deserved, not punishment, not vengeance, not the dramatic downfall of a melodrama. They got irrelevance. They got the slow, quiet, unremarkable experience of being forgotten. Their name vanished from the records. Their estate was carved up and sold to strangers. Their sons scattered. Their legacy dissolved. The Caldwells didn't fall because of a verdict. They fell because the world they built, a world where a woman could be owned, where children could be denied, where a signature could be declared insane because it freed the wrong person, where a judge could be purchased and a family could be erased, that world collapsed. Not in a single dramatic moment, but steadily, irreversibly, under the weight of its own impossibility. Eliza didn't need the world to change for her. She didn't need a judge. She didn't need a ruling. She didn't need anyone's permission or anyone's pity. She just needed her children to outlast it. They did. Dr. Lenora Vaughn Harris was 56 years old when she placed her great-great-grandmother's photograph on a flatbed scanner in her home office in Washington, D.C. She had spent her entire adult life working with archives, 30 years at Howard University, teaching students how to read documents that most people would walk past without a second glance. 30 years of showing 20-year-olds how to interpret the faded handwriting on a 19th century census form, how to recognize the difference between an original document and a copy, how to trace a family through the silences of the historical record, through the gaps, the omissions, the places where someone should appear but doesn't. She had held documents from the 1700s in her gloved hands. She had read slave manifests, the cargo lists of human trafficking, names and ages and prices written in neat columns. She had transcribed auction records in which children were sold separately from their mothers with no more ceremony than a notation of the sale price. She had spent her career immersed in the documentary evidence of American slavery, teaching it, studying it, publishing about it, guiding students through the emotional devastation of encountering it for the first time. She had spent 30 years training other people to look closely at the past. She had never looked closely at her own family's photograph. In 2019, during a personal genealogy project, the kind of weekend undertaking that millions of people pursue without expecting to find anything more interesting than a misspelled name on a census record, she placed the original 1867 print on a flatbed scanner. She set the resolution to 1200 dpi. She pressed the scan button. The machine hummed. The light bar moved slowly beneath the glass. And when the image appeared on her screen, magnified beyond anything the naked eye could perceive unaided, she noticed the edge of a paper in her ancestor Clara's dress collar. A ridge, a texture, an anomaly that resolved under magnification into something unmistakable. She stared at the screen for a very long time. The leather-bound Bible had passed through 5 generations of women in the Vaughn family. Always women. Always the eldest daughter or the most trusted daughter or the daughter who understood, without being told in so many words, that this Bible was not like other Bibles. From Eliza to Clara, from Clara to her daughter Ruth, from Ruth to her daughter Dorothy, from Dorothy to Lenora, each woman kept it the same way, in a drawer, wrapped in cloth, not on a shelf, not on a nightstand, not on display, in a drawer, closed, protected, private, treated not as a decoration or a devotional object but as a responsibility, a trust, an inheritance more valuable than money. Inside the Bible, pressed between the pages of the book of Psalms, Psalm 27, specifically, the psalm that begins, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" were the manumission document and the birth record. The manumission was intact. The paper was yellowed. The ink had faded from black to a soft, oxidized brown, but every word was legible. The date, the name, the clause about children born of her body, the signature. All of it readable across a distance of more than a century and a half. The birth record had suffered water damage at some point, possibly during one of the family's moves within Philadelphia, possibly during a basement flood, possibly during some long-forgotten domestic accident that no one thought to record. The upper right corner was stained and partially illegible, but the names remained, the dates remained, and the critical line, the line that named Thomas Ashford Caldwell as the father of all 3 children, remained readable, faded, but readable. The photograph was tucked inside the front cover. No frame, no glass, no protective sleeve, just a print slightly curled at the edges from more than a century of resting against the Bible's end paper. The image was clear. The faces were sharp. The anomalies, the ridge in Clara's collar, the shadow beneath Eliza's palm, were there waiting, as they had been waiting since 1867. 5 generations of women had kept this Bible closed, safe, and private, not because they knew what the photograph contained, not because they understood the significance of the paper tucked into the collar or the document pressed beneath the palm. They kept it because Eliza told Clara it was for proof, and Clara told Ruth, and Ruth told Dorothy, and Dorothy told Lenora. And not one of them, across 152 years, ever disobeyed. In her 2021 lecture at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the first public presentation of her findings, delivered to an audience of historians, archivists, journalists, and museum visitors who had no idea what they were about to hear, Dr. Vaughn Harris described the moment of discovery. She stood at the lectern, she adjusted the microphone, she took a breath, and she said, "I have spent my career telling other people's ancestors' stories. I have held documents from the 1700s. I have read slave manifests. I have transcribed auction records. I thought I understood what these papers meant. I thought I understood the weight of a document, the power of a name written on a page. But when I saw the edge of that paper in my great-great-grandmother's daughter's collar, when I realized what she had done, what she had planned, what she had built with nothing but cloth and light and the willingness to sit absolutely still, I understood something I had never understood before. She paused. The room was silent. She wasn't just hiding a paper, she was speaking to me. Across 152 years, she was saying, I was here. My children were free. Their father had a name, and I made sure you would know. Dr. Vaughn Harris paused again. She removed her glasses. She pressed her fingertips to the bridge of her nose. The audience did not move. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. No one looked at their phone. And then she said the line that has since been quoted in 14 academic papers, 2 documentary films, and the Smithsonian exhibition placard itself. The line that has become, for many people, the single most concise articulation of what Eliza Vaughn accomplished in a Richmond photography studio in 1867. She couldn't write her own name, but she knew exactly where to place her hand. Dr. Vaughn Harris has a granddaughter. Her name is Maya. She is 12 years old. She attends middle school in Washington, D.C., a city that sits on the Potomac River, 30 minutes by car from the Virginia border, in the same metropolitan corridor where her great-great-great-great-grandmother sheltered in a Quaker meeting house in the winter of 1868. 155 years apart. The same stretch of geography, the same river, different worlds. In 2023, Maya's teacher assigned a project on family history. Every student was asked to research an ancestor and present their findings to the class. Some students brought in photographs of grandparents. Some brought immigration documents. Some brought military service records. One student brought a recipe card in her grandmother's handwriting. Maya brought a printed copy of the 1867 photograph. She stood in front of her class, 27 12-year-olds who had never heard of the Freedmen's Bureau, who had never seen a manumission document, who had no framework for understanding what Reconstruction meant or what it cost, and she told them. She told them about Eliza, about Clara's collar, about the hand on the armrest, about the Bible and the train and the Quaker meeting house and the boarding house in Lynchburg where Margaret Caldwell died without a gravestone. She explained what a manumission was. She described the journey from Richmond to Philadelphia. She showed them the photograph on a screen and pointed to the collar. She pointed to the hand. When her teacher asked Maya what she had learned from the project, Maya thought for a moment. She looked at the photograph on the screen behind her. And she said, she couldn't read, but she was smarter than everyone who was chasing her. She is 12. She is the 6th generation, and she already understands. Look at the photograph one more time. You've seen it before. At the beginning of this video, when it was just a portrait, an unidentified woman, 3 children, a painted backdrop with curtains and a column, a carved wooden chair, the kind of image you'd scroll past in a digital archive, the kind of photograph a cataloger would tag with a handful of keywords: African American, female, children, studio portrait, circa 1860s, and move on to the next file. Now look again. The woman is Eliza Vaughn. She is 28 years old. She was born into slavery on a tobacco plantation in Henrico County, Virginia. She cannot read. She cannot write. She has never signed her own name. She is being hunted by the family of the man who fathered her children, a wealthy white widow with a corrupt judge and 2 hired agents, and a legal petition designed to erase her children's identity from the public record. In a matter of weeks, she will gather these 3 children, tuck a Bible under her arm, and board a train heading north. She will carry nothing else. She will need nothing else. The girl on the left is Clara. She is 9 years old. Inside her dress collar, pressed flat against her chest, folded between layers of starched white cotton, is the paper that proves she was born free. She will grow up to be a teacher. She will teach children to read, a gift her mother never received. The girl on the right is Josephine. She is 6. Her hands hang at her sides. Her face is calm. She will become a musician. She will fill a church with sound for 3 decades. The infant is William. He is 8 months old. He does not know where he is. He does not know what his mother is doing. He does not know that the paper beneath her left palm, the paper pressed between her spread fingers and the wooden armrest, bears his name, his sister's names, and the name of the father who will never publicly acknowledge him. He will grow up to be a publisher. He will build a newspaper. He will put words on paper for a living, the son of a woman who never learned to read a single one. And Eliza's eyes, enhanced, magnified, digitally analyzed 154 years after the shutter opened, are not looking at the camera. They are not gazing at the lens the way a portrait subject is supposed to. Under contrast enhancement, her gaze resolves to a point slightly to the left and slightly downward. She is looking at Clara's collar. She is looking at the paper. She is looking at the proof. She is not posing, she is guarding. A woman who could not write used a camera to build an archive. A woman who could not testify in court used a photograph as a witness. A woman who could not hire a lawyer hid her case inside a child's collar and beneath her own hand. And she did it with such precision, such deliberate, calculated, meticulous care, that the evidence survived for 152 years, survived a journey from Richmond to Washington to Philadelphia, survived 5 generations of women who kept a Bible closed because they were told to, survived water damage and basement floods and household moves and the slow erosion of time, survived until a descendant with a doctorate in archival studies, a woman who had spent 30 years training other people to look closely, finally turned the same scrutiny on her own family's photograph and saw what Eliza had placed there for her to find. Eliza Vaughn did not leave behind a diary. She did not leave behind letters. She did not leave behind a memoir or a speech or a manifesto or a single written word. She left behind a photograph, and inside that photograph, woven into the fabric and pressed beneath the flesh, she placed everything her children would ever need to prove who they were, where they came from, who their father was, and that they were born free. That is not the act of an illiterate woman. That is the act of a genius. The photograph now hangs in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, Level C3, the Slavery and Freedom Gallery. It is displayed behind glass in a climate-controlled case beside the manumission document and the birth record, the same papers Eliza hid in cloth and held beneath her palm 157 years ago. The exhibition title is Resistance in Plain Sight. Beside the photograph, mounted on the wall in clean sans serif type, is a placard. It bears a single quotation. The words of Dr. Lenora Vaughn Harris, delivered at the Smithsonian on a Tuesday evening in 2021 to a room full of strangers who came to hear about an old photograph and left understanding something about love they had never understood before. She couldn't write her own name, but she knew exactly where to place her hand. For 152 years, no one saw what Eliza Vaughn hid in that photograph, but she never hid it for the world. She never intended for historians to find it. She never imagined a museum or an exhibition or an audience of strangers studying her image on a screen. She hid it for her children, for Clara, for Josephine, for William, for Ruth and Dorothy and Lenora and Maya, for everyone who would come after her, every daughter, every granddaughter, every woman who would keep the Bible closed and safe and private because she said to. She hid it for everyone who would come after her and trust that someone, someday, would look closely enough. Someone did. If this story moved you, I'd ask you to do one thing. Look at your own family photographs, the ones in drawers, the ones in boxes in closets, the ones tucked inside books that no one has opened in years, the ones in albums with sticky pages that no one flips through anymore. Look at them. Look closely, because you never know what someone hid for you to find. If you want to hear another story like this one, another photograph that kept a secret for over a century, it's waiting for you right here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And thank you to Eliza for knowing exactly where to place her hand.